The conquest and transformation of Constantinople into the new Ottoman capital of Istanbul marked a new era. Within the empire itself, the old Turkish nobility lost its status, with many of its leaders being either executed or exiled to Anatolia. On the international stage, Mehmed the Conqueror was the most powerful ruler in the Muslim world. Yet, his grand desires were far from satisfied. That satisfaction would only come when the entire Turkish, Islamic and Christian worlds were under his dominion. In order to establish Istanbul, Mehmed repopulated the city with conquered people from all over the empire. Tax concessions were offered to encourage the restoration of trade and industry. Mehmed also encouraged Jews from Central and Western Europe who were suffering intense persecution to migrate to his capital. He also set his army to work rebuilding the physical infrastructure in and around Istanbul. At the same time, Mehmed embarked upon an aggressive effort to dominate the rest of the world. His first move was to end all vassal rulerships and impose direct Ottoman rule throughout his empire in order to prevent rebellion. He then moved into southeastern Europe, annexing Serbia and conquering Morea. Mehmed then demanded that Venice give up its eastern ports along the Aegean coast. When they refused, he launched a war that was to last for 17 years. Bosnia was annexed in 1463, then Albania was invaded and overpowered. In the east, the Turkmen Principality of Karaman and the Tatar Principality of Ak Koyunlu stood against the Ottomans. However, Mehmed was able to take advantage of the dynastic division to defeat Karaman in 1468. This extended the Ottoman Empire as far as the Euphrates River. 5 years later, he routed the Ak Koyunlu to take possession of Anatolia. In 1479, after having repeatedly failed naval raids along the Adriatic coast, Mehmed signed a peace accord with the Venetians. This finally gave the Ottomans control of the ports along the coast. He then turned his navy on the island of Rhodes and then went on to southern Italy. The invasion was proceeding well when Mehmed suddenly died, bringing the campaign to a halt. Over the next century, the Ottoman Empire achieved the peak of its power and majesty. Mehmed's successor was Bayezid II. Over his 20-year rule, he concentrated on consolidation, resolving internal divisions, and cementing the infrastructure of the empire. In doing so, he set the solid foundation from which the conquests of his successors were built. In 1512, new Sultan Selim I took up the mantle of aggressive expansionism that ended with the death of Mehmed. His initial focus was on the Safavids of Iran. Ottoman forces poured into Anatolia and killed thousands of Safavid tribesmen and missionaries. They then moved into Iran itself, clashing with the Safavid army outside of Azerbaijan in August 1514. With the added firepower of cannons and gunpowder, the Ottomans were able to decimate the Iranian army. Despite this military victory, the Ottomans did not gain permanent control over Iran. Lack of booty, combined with propagandist pushback from the Safavids, led to a serious lack of morale among Ottoman troops. Selim decided to retire from the land, and the Iranians were able to claw back most of their territory. Next to fall to the Ottomans were the Mamluks, handing Syria and Egypt to the empire. Selim now ruled over the entire old Islamic Caliphate, with the exceptions of Iran and Mesopotamia. Selim was succeeded by his son, Suleiman I, in 1520. The first 6 years of his reign focused on attacking the Kingdom of Hungary. In 1521, Belgrade fell, and all of Hungary in the years that followed. The Sultan offered suzerainty, by which the Hungarians would administer their own affairs and maintain their military force. But the Habsburg Prince Ferdinand proceeded to claw back areas of northern Italy. By 1528, he had reclaimed all of Hungary. Suleiman responded with a full-scale invasion that drove the Habsburgs from Hungary. He then attempted an invasion of Vienna, but this was unsuccessful. This second failure to take Vienna marked the limit of Ottoman expansion in the west. In 1537, Suleiman launched a major attack on southern Italy, which had been planned in conjunction with France. The French support, however, failed to materialize. An allied European naval fleet attempted to blockade the Ottomans, but was defeated at the Battle of Preveza in 1538. During his rule, Suleiman managed to restore the old international trade routes through the Middle East. With his death in 1566, the gradual but inevitable decline of the empire began. In the latter years of his rule, Suleiman grew tired of military action. He basically retired from public office and consumed himself with the pleasures of life. His absence was filled with an increase in power of the position of the Grand Vizier, who had the authority to demand complete obedience from the people. However, the Grand Vizier had not earned the loyalty of the population, and dissension and division soon resulted. The Devshirme class, made up of the children of soldiers and bureaucrats of Balkan Christians from conquered lands, assumed ever-increasing control over the sultans in order to advance their own purposes. The Turkish nobles, who had once cemented the empire, were no more. As a result of the influence of the Devshirme class, the power of the sultans who came after Suleiman was greatly diminished. During the 1570s, power fell into the hands of female rulers in what was known as the Sultanate of the Women. This was followed by half a century of rule by the chief janissary officers of the empire. By 1625, the empire was fraught with internal problems. Skyrocketing inflation underscored economic hardship, while increased taxes led to resistance and rebellion in one place after another. Peasants fled to the cities, and many farmers walked off the land. A large number of disaffected people joined rebel bands such as the Jalalis. These rebel bands grew in power and managed to seize control of large swathes of territory, yet the Ottoman army was still strong enough to prevent them from assuming total control. Meanwhile, a major European coalition was forming to finally defeat the weakened Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the Habsburgs were set on reconquering Hungary, Serbia, and the Balkans. These efforts were largely successful, and the Ottomans steadily lost territory during the 18th century. Between 1683 and 1699, the Holy League, made up of Poland, Russia, Venetia, and Austria, decimated the Ottoman Empire, establishing Austria as the most prominent power in Central Europe. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottomans had lost all of their territory on the northern coast of the Black Sea. What was left of the once mighty empire splintered into separate provinces ruled by ayans, or lords of the valley. The millet system, by which minority religious and ethnic groups had been able to operate independently from the central monarchy, broke down. This led to Greek independence in 1821, Serbian independence in 1835, and Bulgarian independence between 1877 and 1878. Meanwhile, the ever-worsening economic situation led the Ottoman authorities to become indebted to the major European powers. By the end of the Crimean War, they owed £200 million, with yearly interests and amortization of £12 billion. The final disintegration of the empire took place between 1908 and 1922. Italy declared war on the Ottomans in 1911 and were easily able to take Tripoli and Cyrenaica. The following year, the League of Balkans, made up of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, attacked the now feeble remains of the empire. Following a 1913 coup led by Ismail Enver Bey and Mohammed Talat Bey, members of the Committee of Union and Progress, treaties were signed in London and Bucharest that resulted in the loss of Macedonia, Thrace, and Kosovo. Shortly after that, Albania gained its independence. The Ottoman Empire entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers. Following a 1914 Ottoman attack on Russia's Black Sea coast, Russia declared war on the Ottomans. The defeat to the Allied powers in 1918 found the empire completely shattered. Mehmed VI became Sultan in 1918. 2 years later, however, an alternative government was established with Mustafa Kemal as the president. There followed a brief civil war that ended with the Treaty of Sèvres. This treaty effectively ended the Ottoman Empire. Turkey was declared a republic on October 29, 1923. 150 high-ranking Ottoman officials, including the Sultan, were exiled, and all memory of the once mighty Ottoman Empire was left behind.